Hi, everyone. You're about to hear a special primer episode of my new podcast, Murder Made Fiction. If you listen to this week's Texas Chainsaw Massacre episode, you know that former Horror Queers guest Jen Adams and I have begun a new true crime podcast that looks at fictionalized adaptations of real events. We're talking Jeffrey Dahmer, Ed Gein, Jim Jones, Ted Bundy, and more. And we're looking at movies such as My Friend Dahmer, The Silence of the Lambs, The Sacrament, and House of a Thousand Corpses. Here's a taste of what you can expect, and if you like it, please seek out Bloody FM's Murder Made Fiction on your podcatcher of choice. Without further ado, here's your primer on Ed Gein.
Welcome to Murder Made Fiction, a podcast where we look at horror films and the true crimes that inspired them. I'm Jen.
And I'm Joe.
And today we are discussing a new killer and some new crimes, one of the OGs, and a man who's inspired some of the most iconic horror films of all time.
Yes.
Joe, tell me, what do you know about Ed Gein?
Okay, so the weirdest thing is that I feel like I only know things based on the text that we're going to be discussing this month. So I think he might be a cannibal. I believe he's from down south, and I know that he had some very extreme mommy issues.
Interesting. Okay, yes. So you are on track with some of those things, and I'm curious to hear. Okay, now also, you are coming to us from Toronto.
Right.
So when you say down south, whereabouts are you thinking?
Okay, so one of the things that people may or may not know about me is that my geography is absolute garbage.
Oh,
so
same. Okay.
I'm very much like the southern United States.
Well, I mean, technically he is from south of you. He's actually from Wisconsin.
Okay, so I'm way off.
Well, he is south of you, so technically, you know.
So generous, so generous.
But we got another Wisconsin boy here.
Okay.
I know.
Folks, we planned it in the way that we wanted to start the podcast off with a bit of a bang. So we knew we were going to start with Dahmer because it's a very recognizable name. And then we thought we would shift gears and do Gein, but we did not plan that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. And hey, for the record, we are not picking on anyone from the state of Wisconsin. No. I hear your cheese is lovely.
That's all I know about Wisconsin.
I know, me too. Yeah, and I'm from the state, so I don't have an excuse. But, but yes, he is from Wisconsin. His full name is Edward Theodore Gein. He goes by Ed or Eddie Gein, and I've been reading a book about him where they constantly refer to him as Ed and Eddie, so I'm probably going to interchange those. Also known as the Plainfield Ghoul. The Butcher of Plainfield, and this is kind of what you were alluding to earlier, the original Psycho.
Okay, interesting.
Yes, referring to Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. So yeah, this is, and I think, you know, part of the reason we planned these two to start off is because I feel like the adaptations of these stories go in completely different directions.
Yes. Yeah, very different from Jeffrey Dahmer, where he is front and center, whereas I feel like in some of these titles that we're covering this month on both the main feed and the Patreon, sometimes he doesn't even get name dropped.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And I think once you hear the story and what actually happened, it's interesting. There are elements that have inspired some iconic horror films, and then elements that feel like they have nothing to do with these movies at all. So it's a really interesting story, and the texts that came out of them are very disparate in a really cool way, I think.
Okay, interesting.
All right, so he was from Plainfield, Wisconsin, which is a very, very small town, I think about 40 miles away from La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is also a pretty small town in Wisconsin. So he was a murderer. He was a grave robber.
Oh.
And he was a corpse mutilator. I'm not exactly sure what the proper term of that is. But yeah, so, you know, another overlap with Jeffrey Dahmer. He was active from 1947 to 1957. And if you think about when Psycho came out, that's 1960. So right around that time.
Right.
So he has two confirmed murders. Mary Hogan, who was 51, and Bernice Worden, who was 58. He's suspected of up to 7 murders. From what I was reading, I put that number around 5 and probably just 1 additional murder.
Okay, so not as many as I thought then.
No, and that's the other thing. Like he is technically, I think, a serial killer, but his body count is very low compared to some other people that we're going to talk about.
Right.
But his corpse mutilation body count is high. So he he confessed to mutilating 9 corpses, and that was after digging the bodies up from the local cemeteries. I think, it's logical that maybe there were more than 9, but 9 are that's what he said. So
Right.
So that number is a little bit higher, and that's one of the bigger elements that we're going to talk about when we talk about the story is, digging up a body and, repurposing the body parts, and that is a lot of what has come out in a lot of these adaptations.
Okay. Interesting.
There's not like a classic close call here where he came really close to being apprehended, and part of that is just because there was really only 1 murder, and then he immediately got caught after the second one. So it wasn't like he went on a rampage or anything. But a few local boys reported seeing shrunken heads in Ed's house. And I'm using that terminology because that was the terminology used at the time. But it was dismissed as, quote, a Halloween getup.
Oh.
And this was around a couple of years after Mary Hogan had disappeared, and they still didn't know what happened to her. But he would kind of occasionally make jokes about her being, quote, back at the house.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, that's grody.
Exactly. I know, but he was just kind of a kooky guy. So they kind of dismissed it as oh, Ed's just being weird today.
Well, that's classic serial killer, though. Nobody really suspects them because they're either quiet and unassuming or they're just a little bit odd.
Yeah, and that's definitely a piece of his story. He was a very quiet guy. He didn't really have any close friends. I wouldn't say he really had any friends at all. He was known in the community, but other than his mother, Augusta Gein, who we are definitely going to talk about, that's really his only close relationship. And so once she died, that's when a lot of this behavior started happening.
Okay, so Mama's Boy, the serial killer.
Mama's Boy, the serial killer, yes. And it's really interesting. Something we're going to talk about as we go forward is how this story has really affected a lot of our pop culture ideas of mental health and mama's boys and just horror and killers in general. It's really interesting. I think we can trace a lot of things back to this story.
Fascinating. Okay.
Yes. He was initially found unfit to stand trial and confined to a mental health facility. And then 10 years later, he was deemed fit to stand trial. And this is a little bit odd. I hadn't encountered this before. He was found guilty of first-degree murder, but not guilty due to mental illness.
Okay, so they found him guilty, but then were but also we're going to give you a bit of a pass.
Exactly, yes. Now, he did still stay in this mental health facility for the rest of his life. So he didn't get out, but it's interesting what is actually on the books for this conviction. He was also only convicted of Bernice Worden's murder.
Oh, okay.
And he died on July 26th, 1984 at the age of 77 to complications due to lung cancer. So essentially just died in prison of old age.
Okay.
And by all accounts, his time in prison was actually some of the happier years of his life because his earlier life was not that great.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so some troubling things we're going to talk about. My primary source for this was Deviant, The Shocking True Story of Ed Gein, the Original Psycho, and it's by Harold Schechter.
Excellent.
Yep, so that's where we're going to be drawing, and those are the bare bones of the story. But as I've alluded, there's a lot more to it. There's a creepy house. We've already talked about the mommy issues and the inspiration for some really fucked up and fantastic horror movies that I can't wait to dive into. You can hear all about it on our Patreon Primer episode where we'll go into the details of the story.
Yeah.
If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe. And if you want to get in touch, you can email us at murdermadefiction@gmail.com or on social media at murdermfiction. And if you want to get me personally, it's at Jemferatu on Twitter and Instagram.
And I can be reached at B Stole My Remote. And yes, as we said, we do have that Patreon. It's patreon.com/murdermadefiction. So we've got all of the Jeffrey Dahmer content from last month, but then this month we're going to be digging into the docu-series Psycho, The Lost Tapes of Ed Gein, as well as the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974, as well as a little film called The Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah, so a heavy hitter person-wise and also film-wise. We're digging into some really great stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. So tiers start at $1. They go up to $8. And if you subscribe today, you'll get about 8 hours. But then, yeah, we'll be adding to that over the course of the month. So lots of good stuff to come. So, folks, that's where we're headed with the Patreon this month. But if you're just sticking around this main feed, we're going to go chronologically. We're going to start with a heavy hitter, Jen. Let's check out 1960s Psycho.
Sweet. I have already downloaded the book from Libby, so I'm ready to go.
Ooh, okay.
But until then, let's leave the murders on the screens.